She thought the silence was temporary, maybe just a moment of distance to clear your head, to calm down, to reset. She figured you'd need a few days, maybe a week, and then you'd come back, like you always did. In her mind, this was just another one of those moments where emotions ran high, things were said, maybe a little too much pride got in the way, and you'd eventually swallow it, like you've done countless times before, just to make peace. That's how the pattern had always gone. She'd pull away, you'd chase. She'd say she needed space, and you'd respect it, barely, until the silence became unbearable, and you'd reach back out with that same warmth in your voice, asking if she was okay, trying to fix the broken pieces all over again. You were the emotional safety net she never acknowledged but always relied on. The one who, even in your own pain, would check on hers. The one who made sure that even if things were messy, the connection stayed alive. So when you went quiet this time, she expected history to repeat itself. She thought it was just another pause in the ongoing conversation of your connection, not the final chapter. But this time was different. The silence didn't come with a countdown. There was no ticking clock, no subtle signal that you'd be back, just space, stillness. A lack of presence that felt louder than any shouting match or emotional confession. She kept waiting, at first patiently, thinking, he'll message, he always does. Days turned into weeks, and the confidence she once had in your return started to shake. She checked her phone more than she wanted to admit. She even typed out a message a few times, then deleted it, because in her mind, you were supposed to bend first. You were the one who always cared too much. So she thought, let me just wait him out. What she didn't realize was that this time you weren't waiting anymore. You were done, and that reality didn't hit her all at once. It crept in slowly with every unanswered notification, with every quiet morning, with every night that came and went without your voice. She began to wonder if you were okay, then she wondered if you were angry, then eventually she wondered if you were gone. Not physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually gone. Checked out. Moved on, and that thought frightened her in a way she couldn't explain. Because for the first time, the silence wasn't a pause. It was a presence, a powerful reminder that maybe, just maybe, she had pushed too far. Maybe she had mistaken your loyalty for weakness. Maybe she had counted on your return like it was guaranteed, not realizing that even the most patient souls eventually stopped trying. She replayed the last conversation in her head over and over, trying to find the exact moment where it shifted, where your eyes stopped softening when you looked at her, where your tone became distant, not out of anger but out of acceptance. That kind of detachment that doesn't beg to be noticed anymore. She thought you needed time. She thought this was just one of those cycles. But she never imagined that this time silence wouldn't be your way of coping. It would be your decision, your boundary, your peace. She didn't see it coming because she never thought you'd really leave, even if you weren't physically walking away. In her mind, your heart always had a way back to her. But now all she hears is silence. And the scariest part of all is that it's not accidental. It's intentional. She underestimated the weight of your absence. At first it felt like a game to her, a little tug of war, a bit of power play, a temporary silence meant to shift the dynamic in her favor. She thought your absence would sting a little, but not for long. In her mind, you were always the one who'd fold first. You were the one who couldn't stand the quiet, the one who would eventually reach out just to keep the connection alive. So she treated your absence like something minor, like a pause she could control, like a silence she could end the moment she decided to acknowledge you again. She didn't understand that this time your absence was different. It wasn't meant to provoke her or make her chase you. It wasn't part of a plan to test her. It was a response to everything she didn't think you noticed, the subtle disrespect, the emotional distance, the inconsistency that wore you down over time. It was the result of her believing that you'd always be there, no matter how many times she pushed you away. In the beginning, she mistook your silence for stubbornness. She told herself you were just trying to prove a point, that you needed space to calm down or think things through. She figured once your pride settled, once the dust cleared, you'd come walking back like always. She believed your presence in her life was a given, not something she had to nurture or respect. But the days kept passing and something felt different. The air around her started to change. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was empty. It was cold. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for permission, the kind that says more in its absence than words ever could. She started noticing the little things first. The lack of your voice in the morning, the way her phone didn't light up with your name throughout the day, the way certain songs or places no longer made her feel comfort, but instead triggered a hollow ache she couldn't ignore. She began to realize how deeply your presence had embedded itself into her routine, how natural it had become to have you there, even in the background, even in the smallest ways. And when that presence vanished, she expected a quick rebound, but none came. There were no texts, no late-night calls, no "I miss you" messages, nothing. Just that deafening silence day after day. Then it started to dawn on her. You weren't just taking space, you weren't just busy, you weren't playing hard to get. You had removed yourself from the equation entirely, and that truth sat heavy on her chest. Because now she could feel it, really feel it, the weight of what you used to be in her life, the comfort, the reassurance, the unwavering availability. You had been her emotional anchor, the one who showed up even when she didn't ask, the one who cared in ways she took for granted. And now in your absence, she began to see the impact. Not just in the quiet, but in how everything else started to unravel without you. Her moods felt heavier, her thoughts lingered longer, her nights stretched further. The world didn't feel the same without your energy in it. She tried to distract herself, talked to friends, posted like everything was fine, told herself this was what she wanted, that she needed this space. But it was all an illusion, because no matter how many conversations she had, none of them felt like the ones she had with you. No matter how many laughs she faked, none of them reached the depth of the ones she shared with you. She didn't just miss you, she missed how she felt when you were around. Safe, heard, seen, and that's when the realization truly began to settle in. Your absence wasn't just about the loss of a person. It was the loss of peace, the loss of consistency, the loss of something real in a world that constantly felt shallow. She underestimated your value, not because she didn't care, but because she never imagined a reality where you wouldn't be there. You were her constant, her default, the person who always found a way back, even when things were messy. She assumed you'd keep showing up no matter how many times she created distance. She thought your love had no limit. And maybe it didn't, until it reached its breaking point. Now she's sitting in the aftermath, realizing that silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of truth, a truth she never wanted to face, a truth that tells her you're not coming back this time, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but because your peace started to matter more than the pain of holding on. And that's what she never saw coming. You were always the one who reached out first. It didn't matter who was at fault, who said what, or how heated things got. You were the one who couldn't stand letting things fester. You'd wait a little, let the storm pass, and then you'd send that message, make that call, or show up just to say, let's talk. It wasn't because you were weak, and it wasn't because you lacked pride. It was because you valued the connection more than your ego. You knew that time could harden hearts, and you didn't want to let silence be the reason something meaningful was lost. Even when you were hurting, even when she said things that cut deep, you still found it in you to be the bridge between the distance. That's who you were, the one who didn't give up easily, the one who believed in resolution, not retaliation. And for a while she got used to that version of you. The reliable one, the consistent one, the emotional glue that held everything together when things started to fall apart. She came to expect that if things ever went silent, it would only be for a short while, because eventually you'd give in. You'd pick up your phone, type something heartfelt, and try to mend what was broken. She started to view your effort not as a gift, but as a given. Something she could rely on even when she wasn't giving you the same energy in return. She took comfort in your predictability, your patience, your refusal to let things go without at least trying to fix them. And every time you reached out first, it reinforced the idea that no matter what happened, you'd always find your way back to her. But what she never realized was that every time you reached out, a small part of you wondered if you should have. A small part of you asked, why am I always the one holding this together? You silenced that voice for a long time. You told yourself it was worth it, that love meant effort wasn't always 50-50. Sometimes it was 80-20, sometimes it was 100-0. You were okay with that for a while, but it chipped away at you. slowly, quietly. Every time you extended your hand and she met it with hesitation, indifference, or silence, it left a mark. Every time you opened your heart only to be met with emotional walls, it took something from you. And the worst part, she never saw it. She thought your strength was endless. She mistook your persistence for permanence. You were the one who remembered the small details, the one who checked in when her energy felt off, even if she didn't say a word. You were the one who saw through the masks she wore and made her feel safe enough to take them off. You gave her a place to rest emotionally, even when you were carrying your own burdens. But somewhere along the way, you realized that being the one who always reaches out means constantly putting your heart on the line without knowing if it'll be held or dropped. And you started to feel the imbalance more clearly, the one-sided nature of the connection. The expectation that you'd always fix things, that you'd always make the first move, that the weight of maintaining the relationship would always fall on your shoulders. She didn't realize that reaching out wasn't easy for you. It took courage, vulnerability, a willingness to put aside pride in favor of connection. And every time you did it, you were hoping, even if silently, that maybe this time she'd meet you halfway, that maybe she'd recognize the effort and appreciate it. But that moment never came, not in the way you needed, not in the way you deserved. So eventually you stopped. You stopped being the one who broke the silence. You stopped being the one who carried the emotional load alone. You stopped showing up in places where you weren't met with the same intensity, the same presence, the same willingness to fight for what mattered. She noticed it eventually. That shift, that moment where the message never came, that moment where the silence stretched a little longer than usual, and it confused her, made her question what had changed. Because in her eyes you had always been the fixer, the one who wouldn't let things end on a bad note, the one who cared enough to push past the awkwardness, the tension, the stubborn pride. But this time your silence wasn't a tactic. It wasn't a passive-aggressive punishment. It was a decision. A quiet, powerful choice to stop being the one who always put his heart on the line for someone who rarely met him there. Now she's left wondering why the pattern broke, why the silence has weight instead of tension, why the energy she once relied on so heavily has disappeared. And deep down she knows you got tired of being the only one who reached out, tired of having to always be the emotional first responder, tired of feeling like your feelings only mattered after hers were handled. And as much as she may miss the sound of your voice, the presence of your care, the comfort of knowing you'd always return, what she misses most is the version of you that she assumed would never stop trying. Because that version of you, he finally stopped. Your silence spoke louder than words ever could. It didn't need to come with an announcement, a dramatic goodbye, or a final argument. It was quiet, intentional, and steady, and that's what made it powerful. Because when someone who used to speak life into you suddenly goes quiet, it forces you to sit with everything they used to say and everything they didn't. She didn't expect your silence to hit as hard as it did, because for so long she had tuned out your words. Not completely, not out of malice, but in that way people sometimes do when they grow too used to someone's presence. Your voice had become background noise in her life, reassuring, familiar, always there. So when it vanished, it was like the entire atmosphere around her changed. Things that once felt normal now felt cold. The absence of your words wasn't just silence, it was a presence she couldn't ignore. There's something uniquely haunting about silence when it comes from someone who used to care. When someone who once responded instantly now doesn't reply at all, it's not just the lack of communication that hurts, it's the message hidden within it. The message that says, I've said all I needed to say, I've given all I could give, I'm done speaking into something that doesn't speak back. That kind of silence doesn't beg to be understood, it doesn't chase closure, it just exists, heavy, still, complete, and in that stillness she started to hear everything she had been deaf to before. She heard your exhaustion, your frustration, the emotional fatigue that you had tried to express but couldn't find the right words for. All those times you said you felt alone, unappreciated, dismissed, she finally heard them, not because you said them louder, but because you stopped saying them at all. She realized then that your silence wasn't about punishing her. It wasn't about being cold or manipulative. It was about self-preservation. You had reached a point where talking no longer felt productive, where explaining yourself had become redundant, where defending your feelings just felt like yelling into a void. So you stopped, and in stopping you communicated something deeper than any apology or argument could ever convey. You communicated that you were done trying to prove your worth to someone who should have already seen it, that you were done pleading for the bare minimum, that you were no longer willing to raise your voice just to be heard. And the moment she realized that the silence stopped feeling like distance, it started feeling like a decision, she began to replay every conversation in her head, the ones where you tried to open up and she brushed you off, the times you needed comfort but got criticism. You gave reassurance when you were the one who needed it. You held space for her confusion, her silence, her emotional mood swings, even when it left you feeling invisible. You kept showing up, not because it was easy, but because you believed she was worth it. And in your mind, love wasn't supposed to be convenient. It was supposed to be real. You thought that was what people meant when they said love takes work. So you worked. You worked at it even when you were the only one clocking in emotionally. And in the process, you put your own well-being on hold. You put your healing on pause. You made room for someone who barely made room for you. But one day, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't born from some big blowout or final straw. It was quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. Just a moment of clarity that whispered, "What about you?" And once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. That voice got louder, that inner knowing you had been suppressing, the one that told you this wasn't healthy, that you were becoming a stranger to yourself just to be familiar to someone else. It started to take over. You realized that loving someone should not require you to constantly abandon yourself. That loyalty, when unreciprocated, becomes self-betrayal. You realized that no matter how much you cared, you couldn't keep breaking yourself into smaller pieces just to fit into the limited space she was willing to offer. And so you did something she never expected. You chose yourself, not in a loud, spiteful way, not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet certainty. You didn't slam doors or burn bridges, you just stopped walking towards someone who never truly met you halfway. You stopped explaining your worth. You stopped proving your value. You stopped trying to convince her that your presence was a gift, not an obligation. And in doing that, you reclaimed something she never realized she had taken from you. Your power, your peace, your identity. At first, she didn't get it. She thought you were just being distant, maybe sulking, maybe testing her. She told herself it was temporary, that you'd come around, that once your emotions settled, you'd fall back into the pattern. Because that's what always happened, right? You'd pull away, but never too far. You'd express your hurt, but never let it keep you gone. You were the one who always made things work, who swallowed the hard feelings to keep the connection alive. But this time it wasn't a reaction, it was a decision. You weren't just creating distance, you were creating a boundary, one that wasn't meant to punish but to protect, one that said, "I deserve more. And if you can't give it, I will not keep giving you parts of me that you treat like they're disposable." She started noticing the difference. Not just in the way you stopped talking, but in the way you stopped trying. You weren't cold, but you weren't available either. You weren't angry, but you weren't soft anymore. Your absence wasn't loud, but it was felt. Deeply, because it carried with it the weight of every moment you stayed silent when you should have spoken up. Every time you comforted her while your own heart was breaking. Every chance you gave her to choose you, and every time she didn't. Your choice to walk away without chaos, without drama, was the loudest statement you ever made, because it said, "I love myself enough to let go of what hurts." She began to reflect slowly, painfully. Not because you forced her to, but because your silence and your absence forced her to sit with her own reflection. She started to wonder when exactly you began slipping through her fingers. She replayed the moments she thought didn't matter, the ignored texts, the sarcastic responses when you were being vulnerable, the emotional shutdowns when you needed connection. All the things she once thought you'd just to get over. And now she realizes that each one was a step toward the door. She had mistaken your patience for passivity, your forgiveness for forgetfulness, your love for dependency, but she was wrong. Because now in your absence she sees that your love was a choice, and it's a choice you finally stopped making. Choosing yourself didn't mean you stopped loving her. It meant you stopped loving her more than you loved yourself. It meant you recognized that staying was starting to cost you your peace, your clarity, your growth. And no matter how strong your feelings were, no relationship is worth losing yourself over. She didn't expect that. She didn't expect the version of you who always stayed to finally walk away. Not in anger, not in desperation, but in self-respect, in stillness, in the kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice but speaks volumes in its absence. She thought you'd always be available. Emotionally, mentally, even physically, there was this quiet expectation she held, one that grew stronger every time you forgave easily, every time you returned quickly, every time you gave her access to you without making her earn it, and at first it wasn't a problem for you. You didn't mind being there. You wanted to be present. You wanted to be her safe space. You were proud of how deeply you could love, how consistently you could show up. You thought consistency was what built trust, what formed the kind of bond that lasts. So you made yourself accessible. Through the good days and the bad ones, through her moods, her confusion, her silence, her outbursts, you were there, not out of obligation, but because that's who you are at your core. Someone who loves deeply, who doesn't give up easily, who doesn't see emotional availability as a weakness, but as a strength. But she began to see your presence not as a gift, but as a given. She stopped seeing the effort it took to stay grounded, to keep giving even when you were empty, to respond with kindness even when you were hurt. She stopped acknowledging the small ways you showed up, the check-ins, the little affirmations, the thoughtful gestures. Over time, your effort became the background music to her life, something always playing, always there, always reliable. And because you made it look so easy, she assumed it was easy. She mistook your emotional strength for endless supply. She thought you'd always pick up when she called, always respond when she needed comfort, always be ready to catch her when she fell, even if she never once asked how you were holding up, even if she never thought to return the favor. You were emotionally accessible, but you weren't invincible. And eventually that accessibility started to feel more like exposure, because being constantly available meant constantly absorbing her moods, her words, her distance, her emotional messes. And the more you absorbed, the more you began to feel the imbalance. You realized that availability without boundaries isn't love, it's emotional self-sacrifice, and you started to notice how one-sided things had become. You were always the one asked to understand, to forgive, to empathize. But when you needed understanding, she brushed it off. When you asked for space or softness, she called you too sensitive or accused you of making things about yourself. Your needs were treated like disruptions, like complications, like moments she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with. And still you stayed, still you tried, because that's what you believed love required. But every time she dismissed your feelings, something inside you shifted. Every time she expected access to your heart, your thoughts, your presence, without effort, without reciprocity, you started to feel the quiet erosion of your own emotional identity. And eventually, the question started creeping in. Why am I always available for someone who's barely present for me? Why do I keep showing up for someone who doesn't even ask how I'm doing? Why does she get all of me while I only get fragments of her, on her terms when it's convenient? Those questions didn't come all at once. They came slowly, in moments. In the silence after she ignored something you shared. In the emptiness you felt after pouring yourself out and getting nothing back. In the exhaustion that followed another conversation where you were asked to be the bigger person. Again. And then came the moment when you realized that love without boundaries is not love, it's submission. That your emotional availability had turned into emotional servitude. That by constantly giving her access to your heart, you had slowly been locking yourself out of it. So you did the unthinkable, not just to her, but even to yourself. You stopped making yourself so available. Not in a spiteful way, not as a form of revenge, but out of self-preservation. You stopped answering every call. You stopped initiating every conversation. You stopped rushing to respond to energy that didn't value your presence. You started withholding the parts of yourself that once flowed so freely, not because you were trying to hurt her, but because you were finally trying to protect yourself. She didn't expect that. She didn't expect you to pull back, to withhold, to go quiet. Because in her mind you were her constant, the one she could lean on even if she wasn't leaning with love, the one who would listen, even if she didn't reciprocate. She didn't realize that availability is a privilege, not a guarantee. That emotional access is something earned, not owed. She thought she could keep taking without giving, and that you'd always be there, always open, always willing. But suddenly she found herself standing outside the emotional space she once lived in, and the door was closed. Now she's left wondering where the warmth went, where the softness disappeared to, where that comforting voice, that steady presence, that open heart went. And the truth is, it didn't vanish, it just went inward. Back to the person it belonged to. Back to you. You didn't stop being available to yourself first. And once you tasted that peace, the kind that comes from not chasing, not explaining, not overextending, you couldn't go back. You couldn't unsee what you had seen, that she didn't value your availability until it became a memory, that she only started to reflect once she was locked out of a place she always assumed she had the key to. And now, in your stillness, she's finally feeling the weight of all the times she left you emotionally unattended, all the moments she took and took, believing your presence was permanent. She's realizing that love isn't about constant access, it's about mutual effort, mutual showing up. And that maybe the real reason she misses you isn't just because you're not around, but because for the first time she has to sit with the version of herself who lost someone who never should have been taken for granted. And now, in the quiet she never thought would last, she's finally learning that people don't leave all at once. They leave in stages, in silences, in slow realization. She's learning that when someone stops speaking, it's not always out of pride. It's often because they've spoken every word they had, and none of them were truly heard. And maybe the most painful truth she has to sit with is this: you didn't go silent to hurt her. You went silent because staying loud in someone else's life while going unheard in your own was slowly destroying you. And by the time she understood that, you had already found peace in your absence and strength in your silence.